Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Moran, and your officials for being here for so long. The reason I wanted to wait till the end was because I wanted to look at the strategy for growth, the medium-term economic review, which was released when we came out of the bailout last December. And my first question really is in relation to the status of the document. What is its status? Is it a recommendation to government? Is it an outlining of our obligations in terms of what we have to do in terms of our commitments to our European partners? Was it approved by the Troika or seen by the Troika before it was published?
Well, first of all, this is a government-approved document. Okay, and the genesis for this really came from an earlier period where we indicated that it was important, as we got closer to the end of the Troika programme, that we had in fact actually a plan or a strategy to the direction of travel thereafter. And last year, in particular, it would have been part of our own allocation estimates. We embarked with a group of people, some of whom were in John's area and some others in the department, doing a consultation both across the system and with various other stakeholders about what we thought was important for the Irish economy as it went forward into the next phase of its growth. And we identified relatively quickly on a number. We had actually the IGES, which was all the economists basically of the public sector in one forum up in Dublin Castle. And we identified quite early on a number of sort of horizontal themes that we thought were important as we actually went through the process of considering what were the levers that we could pull going forward. And not unsurprisingly, those were the issues of innovation and how we would get to upskill effectively the economy, the issue of entrepreneurship, and how we would actually move away, or in fact, I suppose in many ways you might think, take advantage of the significant FDI type environment we have, the local domestic entrepreneurial environment in terms of startups, the butcher, the farmer, all of whom are in fact entrepreneurs in their own way, and we sometimes forget that when we think just about tech. But also try and broaden that out so we got into a mindset where people wanted to actually set up their own business as opposed to just go and work someplace for somebody else. And the third element that we thought merited particular attention was that we felt that we were at the beginning of a new era of the way in which Ireland should interact with Europe and the outside world as Europe was developing, and indeed as the Irish domestic population was developing in terms of an open labour force and various other things that we refer to the upside risks that are really things that are constraints that we don't have in Ireland in terms of the growth potential of the economy, because in fact labour mobility in a single market like we have is much different. And we wanted to have an analysis done as well of actually what were the opportunities for Ireland to start thinking of itself less as a national economy but more of a regional economy in a Europe as it was developing a banking union. In presenting the work then, having done that, we decided that it was best presented with three pillars. The first being the requirement to actually maintain a responsible public finance situation, and we can go through the details of that, but that was basically going back to a point in time where we had a state that was paying its own way and we were starting to reduce the debt. The second area was actually looking at the fact that we don't believe an economy can actually function and grow without credit, so finding a way in which we could actually fund that economy. I mean, in many ways, these were issues that we were addressing, but it sort of created a framework for those. And the third area was to actually then do an analysis, which we were considerably assisted by colleagues across the entire system, of identifying, in some way, the way we've been doing anyway, and I referred to it in the speech, of looking at our Irish economy sector by sector. We drew up a sort of a series of sectors, not necessarily aligned to departments, but sectors that we identified with the CSO, say, how can we actually move those different sectors forward? And then we had a stakeholder situation in which we looked at the horizontal issues with, in fact, tables and groups of people which represented each of those sectors, and tried to collect from that the themes and the various issues that were reflected in that. And then what you see in the third section of the document is actually identifying some of those issues that had cropped up, in a sense giving a sense of direction, which was agreed because there was a steering group with the Department of Jobs, ourselves, Public Expenditure and others, giving a sense of direction as to where we thought we should go. And then, in effect, when this document went through to government, there is, in fact, in the document, the fact that all of the departments that are now looking at their own strategies have to do so by reference to this. So the important thing here is that we, again, as happened under the Troika programme to a certain extent, we find that we're moving with a holistic sort of, path forward.
We drafted while we were still in the bailout with a view to when we came out of it, looking ahead.
Exactly.
Bailout. But was it approved or did it have to be seen by our Troika partners?
It didn't have to be seen, but it was actually seen. And in fact, interestingly enough, they recommended that we engage in conversations with some other sort of, treasuries about the fact that with using this framework. But they most certainly, John, you.
Yeah, I mean, Deputy, you mentioned as to whether there were any obligations within the document. I mean, the only legal obligations within the MTES are set out in the fiscal chapter, where we identify the various numerical fiscal rules that we will be subject to, both externally via the Stability and Growth Pact and domestically via the Fiscal Compact, the subset of the Fiscal Stability Treaty that relates to numerical fiscal rules. So essentially we set out how we will comply with those, namely to correct the excessive deficit as part of the corrective arm of the Stability and Growth Pact in a timely manner, i.e. by next year. But then what is required after that, we move into the preventive arm of the Pact, where we will need to make rapid progress towards a balanced budget in structural terms, in other words, when you account for the impact of the economic cycle. So they're the rules on the deficit side. There's also a rule on the debt side.
Sorry, because I do want to come back to this in just a second, but just staying on the Troika side, I mean, did they make any suggestions or amendments to change the language?
Absolutely not.
This wasn't done in that framework. There are no surprises in this document as far as we're concerned anyway. I mean, so it's clearly conditioned by views. And
No, I was just interested in the language on page 26 when it talked about the actual retroactive recapitalisation, maybe decided on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I wasn't sure then if that was something that they'd seen or not.
Well, that just simply reflects the language that I think was already.
That's already been there, and they saw it again and didn't have a problem with it being in the document. Then if we can turn then actually please to page 12 and just back to Mr. McCarthy, the issues you were addressing. There's a table there, and there's two things about the table I wanted to ask about, and the first is the note underneath the table where you talk about the general government balance post-2016 is a technical assumption. It indicates what's required to support achievement of the medium-term objective of structural balance by 2018 and its maintenance thereafter. So when we look at that table and we look at the figures post-2016, I mean, again, when you say a technical assumption, it's a policy decision that will have to come in the future. But is it a necessary policy decision to keep us in line with our commitments?
It is. The reforms of the SGP, which were necessitated by the crisis, so the reforms in 2011, the reforms in particular in the preventive arm of the Pact introduced what's known as an expenditure rule, what's sometimes called the expenditure benchmark. Okay, so to assess compliance with progress towards your MTO, you look at it in the improvement in the structural budget balance, but you also complement that analysis with how you're performing vis-a-vis this expenditure rule. What the expenditure rule essentially says is that you will have nominal growth in revenue in line with the potential growth rate of the economy. Okay, so GDP growing, we'll say 3% just for example, in nominal terms. Over the long run, revenue will grow in line with that. It varies from year to year because the elasticity can vary depending on, for instance, the composition of aggregate demand. But on balance and over time, it tends to move in tandem. So the potential growth rate then, if you maintain expenditure net of discretionary measures on the revenue side, if you maintain expenditure below that potential growth rate of revenue, you automatically get an improvement in your structural position. So that's the technical assumption there, that expenditure net of discretionary measures on the revenue side is kept sufficient to achieve the required improvement towards the MTO.
Right. So
okay. It is quite technical, I know.
No, but so once we move past 2016, if you look at the last line in terms of the general government debt, if we want to move to a position by 2020 where it's below where it's about 93 is the figure there. We have to then follow through with eradicating the deficit and bringing us back to a balance as well in 2020. Is that?
We're required to have a balanced deficit, a balanced budget in structural position by 2018. Okay? Now, for Ireland, as for most other countries, once you achieve your MTO, that should be sufficient to more than comply with the debt correction rule, which I think is what you're asking about, the very last line.
Yes,
okay?
but
the 120th rule.
In order to yes, exactly. In order to maintain the 120th rule, though, and to get to that 0 point in 2018, we also have to continue to reduce the deficit beyond the 3% obligation. We have to keep on going. I mean, I know it's a policy commitment from the government to go to a balanced budget, but it's actually now a requirement in terms of our obligations.
The 3% is set in nominal terms, yes, Deputy. That's it within the corrective arm of the Pact. But the corrective arm consists of two pieces of legislation, the preventive arm and the corrective arm. So once you move out of the excessive deficit procedure, we're legally bound to move towards a balanced budget in structural terms. So you move from headline deficit to the underlying or structural deficit. Okay? There's a legal requirement that member states make sufficiently rapid progress towards their balanced budget, okay? Sorry, towards their MTO, their medium-term budgetary objective. It's country-specific. For us, it is balanced. For other countries with higher levels of debt or problems with demographics, you know, the aging of the population, it's more onerous, and for others, it's less onerous. For us, it's a balanced budget in structural terms. But achieving that path, given that our potential growth rate is still reasonable, should be more than sufficient to comply with this 120th rule, the bottom line, the debt correction rule.
Yeah, I want to move on to that in just a second, but just, I mean, so taking out from that table growth and unemployment for a second, because they're forecasts. I mean, any future government after this one will be bound by those targets post 2015, 2016.
They're legally binding, and we've put it in the Constitution.
Those are the parameters, yeah, okay. And the second thing I wanted to just on the table, I mean, if you look at those two top lines, GDP growth and unemployment, and GDP growth, it's very positive. I mean, was this challenged internally in terms of, I mean, like it's all going in one direction and it's going in a very good way. If we look at forecasts from before, not just from ourselves, but from, say, the IMF, that would be forecast for 2013, that would be very positive. But as we got closer and closer to the actual year itself, and then towards the end of the year, they weren't that positive. So,
the one thing I will say on the growth forecasts, obviously this was a document that government approved, and you know, the numbers are our own forecasts. But the GDP forecasts that are contained in this are very, very similar to the figures that are contained in the Stability Programme, which was published at the end of April. They're very, very similar. I mean, for 2014, we have GDP of 2.1, so very modest changes. But the SPU numbers go all the way out to 2018, and they have been endorsed by the Fiscal Advisory Council. So you're talking about numbers in here that are very, very similar. 0.1 differences here and there that have been endorsed independently. They are also quite similar to, over the medium term, to what European Commission numbers are like, because it's done on a kind of supply side basis. So there's actually not a dramatic difference in terms of the GDP numbers. The likes of the ESRI would actually have a stronger set of medium-term forecasts. The one area where there's probably upside, Deputy, is the second line, and that's the unemployment. Because the figures that we've had subsequent to the MTES have been much more positive than assumed. So in other words, instead of an unemployment rate of 12.5 as embedded there on the second line for this year, the unemployment rate is already 11.7%. So there's probably some upside on that. And we're probably in line to achieve the employment targets embedded in this as well.
okay. So if we go with the 2 or 2.1% growth in GDP for 2014, we're talking then about 3.2 billion. I mean, is that how it, I mean, would that be correct in terms of just 2% of GDP being about that figure?
Oh, yeah, ballpark, yeah. GDP is 160 billion, yeah, give or take.
So what does that mean, though, in terms of anticipated increase in, say, collective revenue? I mean, we saw, I think, that in terms of Q1, we're ahead of target. And we're certainly, I think it's 415 million higher than we were in Q1 2013. Do we have projections for where we think we'll be with revenue by the end of the year?
For this year?
Yeah, and my second question is,
we do, yeah.
Do we have an obligation then to use any extra revenue that comes in, more than what was anticipated, to put directly towards the debt, reducing the debt burden?
Well, the nominal tax revenue would be driven by nominal GDP as opposed to the real GDP, okay? But in terms of what we're saying for this year, the figures are set out in the stability programme. Bear with me for 1 second. Total tax revenue in 2014, we're looking at just over 40 billion, so it's in the SPU on page 15. Okay. Sorry, that's in the stability programme. Sorry, slightly different document there.
What's that like? I mean, in terms of, though, an increase in terms of what's anticipated, is that still in line, given that our Q1 figures are up on what was anticipated? Have we remodelled yet to see what they might be?
We're very much in line with where we thought we would be, and I think that is the expectation for the year as a whole.
Okay.
We are still very much of the view that we will achieve our budget target of 4.8% of GDP, with both revenue and expenditure pretty much performing in aggregate terms where we thought they would be.
Okay.
Okay.
But those increases, thank you, Chair. Those increases, though, then in that increase in growth, though, I mean, it isn't enough to take care of, say, any correction in the deficit that we need to make in terms of actually making cuts in departments across the government. We still have to make those cuts as anticipated. I think the figure was 2 billion.
Are you talking for 2015?
Yes, 2015.
Yes, I mean, we set that out in the stability programme on the basis of nominal GDP growth, well, of real GDP growth of 2.7%, nominal GDP growth of 3.6%. That on that basis, we will need additional consolidation of about 2 billion in order to achieve the required correction of the excessive deficit by next year, which is our legal requirement.
Okay. And so, I mean, in terms of just like discovering how that 2 billion will be broken down and cuts across departments, that will take place in terms of the comprehensive review of expenditure. Is that
absolutely later on this year?
That hasn't commenced yet?
I think I'm not sure. It's probably underway.
Are working on it, but I don't think it's
okay. And when's it due to conclude then? Does it conclude before?
Sorry, I just don't know, Deputy.
Okay.
But obviously it would all feed into the budget process.
Yes, the comprehensive review of expenditure is taking place at the moment. Departments are working on it. The idea is to get material in from the departments before the end of June. But realistically, the government will be looking at the material that comes in from departments, taking on board inputs from the Department of Public Expenditure, but it will merge into the consideration of the budget, which will be a matter for September and the first half of October.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, I mean, I did cut my time short initially, so I could come back to this.
We're at the end of the meeting now, and I'd ask you to conclude by asking your last question.
Chair, in fairness, I mean, I did give way at the beginning of the meeting.
I've asked you to conclude, Deputy. We're here since 12 o'clock.
I understand that, Chair, but I did think this
Can you
document
please
was...
ask your last question?
Okay, I'll ask my last question. In terms then of the growth that's going to come, that's anticipated for this year, and the correction in the deficit that we have to make anyway in terms of reducing spending across the government departments, any growth that we have is going to be used more than likely to offset the tax burden. Is that what we're looking at doing? And if that's what we're looking at doing, because it has been speculated, and it is mentioned actually in the document that we would attempt to do that. In page 21 it says, provided potential revenue growth is reasonable, taxation reductions can be achieved over the medium term. Do we know yet how much money we might be looking at in terms of financing that reduction, say by way of changing the tax bands?
We don't at this stage. I mean, we've set out our projections as per the stability programme, what we think we need to get to 2.9% by next year, and all those decisions are obviously a matter for government later on in the year.
But the calculations to inform those policy decisions, have they been made yet?
Well, the calculations are our growth projections as per the stability programme.
But, for example, if you were to increase the standard rate of tax, that band by €10,000, we know it would cost about 1.3 billion. So are you now trying to see if that will be available in the economy across not just this year but next year as well, because you are talking about forecasting?
All those considerations will be done in the lead up to the budget and see what those costs are, and they will all feed into the overall process.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Murphy. I'm not going to ignore